with that, one of the most awaited events for this Kolkata Literary Festival is the Great Indian Paradox of Mr. Shashi Tharoor.
Hello everyone. So it seems like keeping with the theme of the day today, Dr. Tharoor is a little late.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am sure you all are waiting for this grand event, the Great Indian Paradox. Well, Mr. Tharoor is running a bit late, but we are going to start very shortly. Before that, just a short introduction of today's panel. Mr. Shashi Tharoor is a politician, diplomat, columnist, and writer. His latest book, published in 2018, is titled Why I Am a Hindu. The moderator of this event, Mr. David Dhavidar, is a well-known publisher and author of 3 novels. He is the managing director and publisher of Aleph Book Company, a literary publishing firm he co-founded in partnership with Rupa Publications India in 2011. For any other further informations regarding our panelists tonight or any other delegates of the APJ Kolkata Literary Festival, you can visit us on www.aklf.in. Now, I understand you all are eagerly waiting for Mr. Tharoor to just come here and start with the event. And as they say, sabar ka phal meetha hota hai. So just thoda aur sabar kar lijiye, and then Mr. Tharoor will be here very shortly and we will be starting this event and the grand event of tonight. Thank you so much.
I guess we're going to jump right in. Shashi was held up in traffic. He needs no introduction. He's, he's one of the most popular people on social media. He's written close to 20 books. He's been a minister. He has been the number 2 in the UN, and so on and so forth. But I'm going to sort of try and break the ice a little bit by asking him a question that he's never been asked before. You've heard of demons, not the sort of evil creatures, but D-A-E-M-O-N. Many cultures have a spirit animal. What is your demon?
My gosh, I'm not sure I have one. I'll tell you, the closest I would come to is probably you, David. I think you. He's been my demon, my muse, my inspirer, my guide. You know, David published the Great Indian Novel way back in 1989. And though in between he wasn't my publisher for a few books, we have resumed our relationship. And I think that he has been so much a part of my writing life that I think we will now officially call him the demon.
All right. Now I want to ask you a question, which is slightly at odds with the subject. I mean, where the subject is concerned, because it's the Great Indian Paradox, we're going to talk a little bit about the country, a little bit about our beloved Prime Minister, and about us Indians as well. So we will get to those 3 sections of the evening. But
Sure.
before we start, I want to bring up something that another writer of mine, another friend of mine, N. Ram, was talking to me about 2 days ago, where Modi and Rafael are on the front pages of the Hindu and pretty much everything today. What would you like to say about that?
Well, you know that we have been in the Congress party pointing at this issue for some time, and I'm proud to say that Rahul Gandhi was practically a lone voice in the country in showing that there were some serious irregularities in the entire deal. That there was, there was something rotten, not quite in the state of Denmark, but in the state of France when this deal was modified in 2015. And I think what Mr. Ram's very detailed expose today reveals, with considerable analysis, facts and figures, is that it's not just dal mein kuch kala hai, lekin dal hi kala hai.
Okay, so, your latest book, your latest bestseller was called The Paradoxical Prime Minister. And now that we're on the subject of Modi, what would you say are the 3 top paradoxes about Modi?
Well, the one that started me off actually goes back to an earlier book that we did together, a book called India Shastra, Reflections on the Nation in Our Time, which was published at the very end of 2014. It was essentially a compilation of essays, most of which have been written over the preceding 6 or 7 years. But of course, it took into account the first 6 months of Narendra Modi's rule, during which time, some of you may remember, I was being critiqued or attacked, if you want to be less polite, for having been too willing to give Narendra Modi the benefit of the doubt. And I explained that I was doing so for two reasons. One was out of respect for the wishes of the electorate that had just, after all, given him a decisive victory in Parliament. And the second was in order to take him at his word. He was saying a lot of liberal things. Remember, not just Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, but he was saying, I will be a prime minister for all Indians. He was saying that I will only treat the Constitution as my holy book. I know no other holy book. He talked about the government. The government has no business to be in business. He talked about minimum government, maximum governance. So all of these things are being said. And I said, look, let us welcome him for saying the right things, because that then gives us the yardstick by which he can be judged in the future. However, within my party and within my segment of public opinion, very clearly that argument didn't wash. And I took a fair bit of flack for it. But within 6 months, I realized that that benefit of the doubt was no longer being earned. And in the introduction to India Shastra, published, as I said, 6 months after his coming to power, I said the following. I said that it seems to me the central contradiction of Mr. Modi's relatively new government and himself is that he says a lot of these very liberal things, but that he rests for support for political viability and survival on the most illiberal elements in Indian society. And I published that, and then Mr. Modi spent the next 4.5 years proving me right. So I began the new book with the words, I told you so. And I quoted that paragraph. So that's the first paradox. A second paradox, and there are so many, David. I was sitting with one of your colleagues at the time of the launch of the book, and within 15 minutes of conversation, we had identified 18 paradoxes. That's when we decided to run that Twitter competition, asking people to come up with their own Modi paradoxes, and gave away prizes to the best ideas. But the fact is that one obvious paradox is, here is the most eloquent rhetorician in India, somebody who probably is the finest and most fluent orator in Hindi we've seen in contemporary politics, and yet whenever anything truly tragic and moving happens, instigated by his supporters, so when Muhammad Akhlaq is murdered outside his own home for carrying a bag of meat that people wrongly suspected was beef, when Pehlu Khan was killed and the results are put on YouTube of his beating up because he was transporting cows to a dairy with a permit, when Dalits were flogged in Rajasthan or lynched in Bihar, Jharkhand and Madhya Pradesh, when Rohit Vemula committed suicide in Hyderabad, when any of these national tragedies that appeared on the front page of the newspaper and that caused us all anguish, because it was impossible not to be moved by the pain and suffering. For example, 15-year-old Junaid Khan coming back from buying clothes for Eid, and he was on his way back home to show these new clothes to his mother, and he is stabbed 27 times on a train and thrown off the train purely for being Muslim. Now, when you look at all of these stories, what does Mr. Modi respond with? This great, eloquent, loquacious, articulate orator with a deafening silence. He has nothing to say. And that's, again, a Modi paradox, which is very, very deeply troubling. I mean, there are more. You want me to go on? I will, but I'm taking too long already.
We'll do a few, and then we'll go on to the country, because Modi is not India yet.
He won't be. It's very clear after May.
So essentially, what you're talking about was what you have entitled the modification of India, which is where he's undermining very key traits and institutions of India. I also want to I want you to talk briefly about, this much vaunted reputation he has for governance, and you say he has misgoverned the country.
Well, yes, because, we've got right now the single most centralized power hungry PMO since the days of the emergency, where every decision is taken in the Prime Minister's office, where authority previously delegated to ministers, ministries, is now only exercised by the Prime Minister and his own minions, and where, as a result, you're in a position where decisions penned, because they are human beings, the people in the PMO, and they only have the same number of hours that God has given the rest of us, and they're not able to clear the sheer volume of appointments that they are required to deal with. So we've never seen a more inefficient government when it comes to vacancies across the board, because the processing of vacancies, which used to be done in different ministries, all now needs PMO clearance. So everything from administrative tribunals to the disaster management authority to the information commissioners and so on, just drag on and on with empty positions for months. And whereas with the information commissioners, one suspects they really want to keep those positions vacant because they want to hollow out the information commission. Certainly everywhere else, it's simply that they have been reduced in efficiency by the power hungriness, the desire to control of our present dispensation. And the result, therefore, is that instead of the more efficient government we were promised, we have a less efficient government because of a greater centralization of power. Mr. Modi thought that he could run India the way he ran Gujarat, where he essentially appointed ministers as token figureheads and worked directly with the bureaucracy. Well, that doesn't work. And in India, what you've got today is a situation where very often it's true that the ministers don't live up to the theory of parliamentary accountability and of collective cabinet responsibility for decisions, because these are decisions they had no role in taking. The decisions are taken for them by the PMO, sometimes with their bureaucrats in the know, sometimes not even. And the ministers are then reduced in parliament during question hour, when question hour actually happens, to have bureaucrats sitting on the side, sending them little slips of paper, telling them how to answer an awkward question they're not prepared for. That's the kind of situation we're in at the moment of the government. So to talk in terms of a more efficient government has become a joke. We have a much less efficient government.
You devote an entire section to Modi's mishandling of the economy. Jobs, growth, etc., etc. Do you want to,
Well, the fact is that unfortunately the economy was supposed to be his big strength. Remember, many people voted for him, not because of Hindutva, which obviously does not enjoy the kind of support around the country, or did not enjoy at that time, that they were hoping it would. Instead, they voted for Modi because of the development argument. He said, I have brought Gujarat to the peak of prosperity. I shall be the CEO of India Inc., the way I've been of Gujarat Inc. And some people bought into that narrative. Well, the Gujarat narrative was a bit blown out of proportion anyway, as I demonstrate in the book. But in the Indian narrative, we've seen nothing but a spectacular record of failure. He promised enhanced economic growth. Instead, the demonetization inflicted on the nation has hit economic growth by a factor of 1.5% of GDP. He promised, as you all know, 2 crore jobs a year. In 5 years, that should have been 10 crore jobs. He's not even produced 10 lakh jobs, forget 10 crore. If you look around the country at the kinds of normal economic activity that used to sustain us, lots of small and micro enterprises, 2 employees, 3 employees, 5 employees, that kind of thing, a record number of them have shut down, partly because of and since the demonetization. Agriculture is in crisis. We have had farmers, anguished farmers, marching in the streets of Delhi and, of course, across other states. We have seen a situation in which exports have gone down while manufacturing output is absolutely at rock bottom. There is literally no success story to point to. All we have is a wonderful collection of slogans. Stand up India, digital India, make in India, start up India, sit down India. But the economy has absolutely no numbers to show what success story this government can point to.
Just 2 more Modi questions before we move to the country in general. The first is, you have another section devoted to his foreign policy. Could you tell us why that's a sham?
Well, I'll tell you, there's no question in my mind that many people wrongly think that Mr. Modi has somehow enhanced India's stature in the world. let me say very bluntly, the one good thing we can applaud him for is the amount of energy and zeal he has shown for his foreign travels. He has zipped around the world. I think there have been 82 countries covered in 59 trips. Somebody worked out that he has spent 1 year of his 5-year term abroad. And indeed, somebody else calculated that he's made more speeches in foreign parliaments than he has in the Lok Sabha, of which he's a member. But the question is, what has all this brought us? And sadly, you look around, you see again a record of great disappointment. He gives all these hugs to world leaders, but the world leaders don't seem to hug him back. President Trump declined his invitation to come to Republic Day. We've had Xi Jinping, with whom he shared a swing on the banks of the Sabarmati. While he was here, Chinese troops came and pitched their tents across the border. And last year, as you remember, Doklam, 72 days of the Chinese trying to build a road whose only imaginable purpose would have been in the event of conflict with India. Otherwise, it would have been a road to nowhere. And we're seeing embarrassment after embarrassment around us. Just take the subcontinent. We've got many of the countries in our neighborhood, Nepal, which they used to boast of their affinity to the only Hindu kingdom. Well, it's no longer a Hindu kingdom, but more important, they've now opened up their northern borders to China, which is busy building roads and railway lines, principally provoked by Modi's ill-advised boycott of land trade between India and Nepal for 2 or 3 months during the Madhesi agitation in defense of people on the plains of Nepal, the foothills of Nepal, which, needless to say, have completely antagonized the ruling establishment of that country. We've had embarrassments and setbacks in Sri Lanka, where the Chinese foothold has grown. In the Maldives, until an election 2 months ago saved our face, though we had nothing to do with it, we had the humiliation for 1.5 years, 2 years, of actually seeing advertisements in the newspapers for job vacancies in Maldives saying Indian citizens need not apply. That was how bad things were. And as for Pakistan, I think it would be a wonderful thing if Mr. Modi told us if he has a Pakistan policy. We have seen nothing but ups and downs, more ups and downs than a child's yo-yo. Starting off with don't feed chicken biryani to the Pakistanis, to inviting Nawaz Sharif for his swearing in, sentimental exchanges of saris and shawls to each other's mothers, followed by artillery firing on the border, setting up a talk with foreign secretaries in Delhi, then suddenly cancelling it at the last minute because the Pakistanis did something they've always done before, which is talk to the Hurriyat. Then, having made all these nasty people, you either talk to the Hurriyat or you talk to us, suddenly the national security advisors are meeting in Bangkok, presumably because there are no Hurriyat in Bangkok, so they can do it there. And this is just the first 6 months. It goes on and on and on. The SAARC summit in Kathmandu, where Mr. Modi is photographed ostentatiously reading a brochure while the Pakistani Prime Minister walks past him, so he doesn't have to say hello. And then it's revealed that he met the same Pakistani Prime Minister in the same hotel in the suite of an Indian businessman. You find that they meet together in Uri, and there are all these wonderful declarations coming out of it. And then suddenly the Pakistanis repudiate every word that the government is putting out about them. You have this whole astonishing episode of the Prime Minister deciding on a whim when he's leaving Kabul to suddenly go and attend Nawaz Sharif's birthday celebration and his granddaughter's wedding in Lahore. At such short notice did he make that decision that there wasn't enough time for the Indian High Commissioner in Islamabad to reach Lahore airport to receive his own Prime Minister. Now that's the kind, you can't make foreign policy on a whim, and certainly not on Pakistan, because remember that the BJP and Mr. Modi himself had consistently attacked Dr. Manmohan Singh every time he tried to be friendly to Pakistan, saying don't even dream of reaching out a hand to Pakistan, let alone going there until they have taken satisfactory action on the perpetrators of 26/11 and shown that they are resolute in cracking down on terrorism. And yet suddenly that entire standing pillar of BJP foreign policy for many, many years disappears literally with one phone call from Mr. Modi because he doesn't have a clue what his own policy is. So foreign policy cannot be treated in this way, David. And I'm sorry to say it has been another area of great disappointment for those who thought that Mr. Modi might be a breath of fresh air in government.
Okay, one last question on our Prime Minister, and that is, you tell a lot of stories about him in your wonderful kind of profile of him. Would you like to give the audience one of your favorite stories about Mr. Modi?
Oh, there's so many. I'll just quote one thing he said to me once, which I was very struck by. He said that, in some parts of our country, he said, if a man of a lower caste grows a mustache or rides a horse, people attack him. And he said, that's what's happened to me. And it was a very revealing insight about the chip that he has on his shoulder, which is a perception. Somehow he feels that people like him have been excluded from the sort of governing class of India, and that therefore he is being unfairly attacked or criticized, and therefore every criticism of him is illegitimate because he has somehow persuaded himself that he represents a sort of authentic leadership for the nation that nobody else is entitled to. And the sad thing about this is not just that he believes it, and he and his very formidable electoral machine have got some Indians to believe it too, but that it unfortunately makes him oblivious to genuine constructive criticism and objections. One of the most striking things about this BJP government is its complete deaf ear to any point of view from the opposition side, whether on substance, whether on tactics, whether on details. I've seen government from the inside when my party was in government, and what I've seen is certainly not only respect for the opposition, but a willingness to listen to and occasionally to change our positions or our minds because of what the opposition say. I've seen it time and time again. I cannot point to one example, not one, in the entire time of this government, where they have listened to the opposition or changed their mind or even changed two words in a routine bill or changed a routine practice in order to accommodate the opposition. And to my mind, that is very dangerously wrong. When you have a prime minister who identifies himself with the nation, when the ruling party considers that it is the government and the government is the nation, and then any criticism of either the prime minister or the government becomes by definition anti-national, then you are attacking the very fundamental pillars of democracy. And to my mind, that is the biggest danger of our paradoxical prime minister. The individual may come or go, but India survives. India has to last beyond any such individual. And for that, we have to strengthen and build up the institutions that uphold our democracy, which is precisely my worry, is that these institutions have been deeply damaged in the last 5 years. And if by some fluke he gets another chance to do more damage, India's democracy will not be what it's been for 70 years.
Well, from the specific subject of prime ministerial misdoings, the country as a whole, you've written several books on them, starting from your novel. You have India as being your subject. I want to zero in on religion, specifically Hinduism. That was the subject of your other major book in the recent past. Tell us about some of the contradictions within Hinduism that you address.
I'm not sure contradiction is quite the word. I mean, Hinduism is a very unusual religion in that it doesn't actually have any compulsory rites or rituals or obligations. I mean, there is no Hindu Pope, there's no Hindu established church, there's no Hindu Sunday, right? Because any one of the 7 days of the week can be your special holy day consecrated to a particular deity. You don't have one image of God because Hinduism started off with a rather Islamic idea of what we would see as the Nirguna Brahman, the idea of the Brahman without any qualities, any form, any shape. And then as the sages realized that people needed something they could latch their worship onto, and in the Vedic years people were worshipping fire and mountains and trees and rivers, they said, all right, we'll have the Saguna Brahman, the Brahman with qualities, with shape and form. But since no one really knows what shape and form God is or the Brahman is, you're free to imagine the divine as you see fit. So if you want to imagine God as an 8-armed woman running a tiger, as all the Durga worshippers here may well do, that's fine. If you want to imagine God as a pot-bellied man with an elephant head, Ganesh, as I do, then fine, that's fine with you too. And by the same logic, Other faiths and other ways of worship are equally valid. So if you really wanted to worship God as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, that would be acceptable too. The only thing, as Swami Vivekananda pointed out, is that you cannot say that only one way of worship is valid and everything else is wrong. To be a Hindu, you have to accept the proposition that he articulated in Sanskrit, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vedanti, which is that there is only one truth, but that the sages call it by different names. Or as he described, quoting the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, he said that just as many different rivers flow straight and crooked in different directions and end up in the same sea, so also all different forms of worship essentially reach the same God, the same Brahman. And this idea is one of the, if you like, the great contradictions, because in other faiths, there are fundamental tenets you cannot move away from, and moving away from them is not only an act of abjuring the religion or of abandoning the faith, but actually it's an act of apostasy. So you have to have these compulsory beliefs in other faiths. In Hinduism, you don't even have a single sacred book. You have multiple sacred books, which in turn gives you a lot to choose from, a lot to actually dip your what's the word I want, your sensibilities into, and choose as you see fit. Now, this extraordinary religion in many ways is sort of almost perfect for the 21st century. It's kind of an open source faith in terms of today's internet language. It is like a World Wide Web. It's widely connected in a dispersed sort of way. There is no monolithic structure. It gives you very many ways to reach out to the Godhead, and it allows you the freedom in the end to personalize your own faith, to be the kind of Hindu you choose to be. And to my mind, that's perhaps, if you like, the most interesting feature of all. Hinduism remains to this day perhaps the only major religion that doesn't call itself the only true religion.
So, perhaps not paradoxes, but, the attempts today, it's not recent, it's been going on for a while now, to traduce and pervert the basic tenets of Hinduism.
Well, there is this curious drive by people associated with the so-called Hindutva movement, which I have argued in the book has nothing to do with Hinduism. It really is very distinct from the kind of Hinduism of Vivekananda, Adi Shankara, Mahatma Gandhi that I tried to summarize for you. It is in fact a political doctrine born in the 1920s when Savarkar came up with the term Hindutva, out of the very same currents of ethnic nationalism, race pride, and so on that animated the emergence at the same time in different countries of similar movements. The fascists in Italy, the Nazis in Germany, the movement of Caetano in Portugal, eventually the Francoists in Spain, they all, Oswald Mosley in Britain, they all basically followed the same tenets of asserting race pride, of asserting ethnic nationalism in a very militaristic and jingoistic way, and speaking of their rights to have their own living space. And this is exactly what Savarkar did. He actually uses the word race when he describes Hindus rather than religion. And he himself was not a terribly religious man. It was about Hindus as an identity. And in this artificial construct of Hinduism, he created a notion of India as a Hindu Rashtra, which has since been the animating spirit of the Hindutva movement, articulated by many, but particularly the three that I pick in my book, Why I'm a Hindu, are Savarkar himself, M.S. Golwalkar, the longest serving Sarsang Chalak of the RSS, who was RSS General Secretary, basically its head, from 1940 to 1973. And of course, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, who though he had a short-lived stint as head of the Jan Sangh, was its General Secretary for many years, and is to this day regarded as the principal ideologue of the political arm of the Hindutva movement, the Jan Sangh, which is then morphed into the BJP today. Now, if you look at what they stand for something which really is the antithesis of this inclusive, accommodating, liberal, expansive view of Hinduism that I have described to all of you. And when David asks me about, are they trying to do something to it that's not what I claim Hinduism is, yes, the answer is apparent. They're actually in many ways trying to Semitize the Hindu faith. they're trying to make it like the very faiths they despise, the very faiths they attack. They're trying to make it much more of a community faith than an individual one, much more of a faith with sort of one major place of worship to focus attention on, one major God to pray to, one major holy book to accept. Sushma Swaraj even proposed that the Bhagavad Gita be declared the national holy book of India, something which I had attacked in my own writings at the time. So you've got this entire current which seeks to actually reduce Hinduism from this rather vast, capacious, inclusive, accommodative faith to something that is much more like the faith of one book, one God, one church, one pope, one structure, that may suit those who want to have a hierarchical obedience from all Hindus, but doesn't suit most Hindus.
Staying with Hinduism for a bit, you know, one of the things that is obviously led to a lot of tension within the religion is the pull between tradition and modernity. You know, and you've spoken about one of the latest manifestations of that, which is the Sabarimala controversy. How does one deal with a situation such as that?
Badly, because everybody concerned has dealt with it badly. The Supreme Court passed a judgment which was by a 4-1 majority. And, you know, many Hindus have felt aggrieved, even directly violated by the terms of this judgment. And this created an opportunity for the BJP in Kerala, which actually has been a fairly marginal party, very much third in the Kerala electoral sweepstakes, never won a Lok Sabha seat and has only ever won one assembly seat. Suddenly the BJP has found an excuse to revive itself. Hinduism is in danger. We are here to protect you. Out in the streets, vandalizing cars, obstructing the women who sought to go there, etc. And the result of all of this has been, I'm afraid, that the sacred shrine has been reduced to a stage of political theatre. Now, the irony is there is no doubt that people were hurt, because the notion of the Sabarimala deity, Lord Ayyappa, like all Hindu deities, worshipped in multiple temples, right? So there are hundreds of Ayyappa temples in Kerala and elsewhere that you can go to without any restrictions, including of gender, age, whatever. But this particular shrine in the middle of the forest of Sabarimala has a legend associated with it. And that legend is that the deity is a Naishtika Brahmachari. He was supposed to marry this beautiful princess. In some legends, she's the sister of Mahishasur, the demon king, slain by Durga. But Mahishasura's sister then transforms herself into this beautiful goddess. But Ayyappa doesn't want to marry her or anyone else. So he gets away from her with the promise that he will not set eyes on any woman of reproductive age until he can marry her. But of course he never does. He has merged into the deity in that shrine. There is now a separate temple to Mallikapuratamma, which you can go and worship to. So it's a very complicated series of legends and stories around it. But therefore the whole logic is, if you go to the Sabarimala shrine because you believe in that deity, you will not disrespect his wish to not see women of reproductive age. So the paradox of women wanting to go there is, the act of going there is practically, to many believing Hindus, like an act of insulting or spitting on that deity. This is the huge paradox. Now, I don't know if there's an easy way out. I can tell you that as a sort of liberal constitutionalist, egghead if you like, my first reaction was to welcome the court judgment, saying, you know, change comes in all sorts of ways, and court rulings can often bring about change, as we've seen in other countries. Brown versus the Board of Education, that desegregated American schools, would never have been passed by the parliament, but the courts brought it in. Now it's completely accepted, and so this is how change comes. But I was not prepared for not just the ferocity of the reaction, but the pain embedded in the reaction. I started speaking to a number of people in Kerala and my own constituency, especially women. I was very curious as to what women thought, particularly women of that particular age. And I must say, an overwhelming number. And when I say overwhelming, I'm talking like 95%. I mean, It's an unscientific and random and inadequate sampling. But there have been informal polls which show figures close to that. They all said, no, we should not go. It is a violation of the temple's sanctity. We are ready to wait. Now, the question is, where does belief start and where does constitutionalism begin or end that question of religious belief? It's a very, very tough one. There genuinely is no easy answer. And if I were to say to you, look, let's respect the wishes of the believers, you would turn around and say, but there was a time when believers didn't want Dalits to enter the temples. There was a time when believers wanted widows to immolate themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands. And I would have to tell you, you're right. That was true, or that is wrong. And you can say, well, who is not to say that a future generation wouldn't consider this to have been wrong? It's just that my dilemma is compounded by the fact that as an elected public representative, I owe a duty of accountability to the people I seek to represent. And their fears, their anxieties, their pain is very real to me in a way that they can't be for an op-ed writer or a commentator.
I don't know how we're doing for time, actually. I mean, we're just sort of happily sort of trundling along.
If we're able to run slightly over time because we started a bit late, I'm happy to do so. I'm really sorry that we underestimated the traffic.
Well, a few more paradoxes. How do you account for the persistence of violence in the land of the Mahatma? Is that a false construct that we're a non-violent people?
Well, every society has specific strains in it, both of good and bad. I don't think there are any exceptions. But there are, if you like, enabling features in every society. So in America, the wide prevalence of guns and the frontier culture of the Wild West and so on is still there. And that's why you have more shooting deaths in America per head of population than any country in the world. In India, by sort of analogy, we have a strong strain of ahimsa, which has been taught to us by the Jains, in a different form by the Buddhists, which is absorbed by Adi Shankara into Hinduism, which Mahatma Gandhi made into a ruling credo of the nationalist movement in the 20th century. It was even a successful tenet of the nationalist struggle that non-violence brought about results to actually transform our country in a positive way and to win us freedom through non-violence. And therefore it has a place in our society that is different from and perhaps more exalted than the place that non-violent thinking has in other society. Certainly no one in America would go around saying we're a non-violent society, even if the vast majority of Americans are non-violent. Similarly, no one in India would go around saying we're a violent society, but there are people in our country who are violent and who would like to resort to violence very easily. Now, that doesn't fully answer your question because there is another part to it, which is that much of violence in our country is engineered. You know, there is this perception that there is this spontaneous combustion that takes place when some incident ignites passions all over. Let me assure you, people as individuals may get angry, but it takes leadership, organization, and very often political ideology to convert a momentary spasm of anger or rage or hurt into violence. That is 9 times out of 10 engineered violence. People deliberately want to whip up the passions of a crowd, and then, of course, the passions of the crowd manage to sweep through and you get a mob, and then very often you have lynchings and killings and deaths and riots and so on. I've tried to explore some of the psychology in my book Riot, my novel, which David also published, and in launching the book he said something you don't normally hear about novels. He said this is a necessary novel, which I was struck by when he said it. And I think it actually was a very interesting word because 6 months after I wrote it came the Gujarat riots in which so many died. And I realized that indeed you do manufacture violence in our country, and there is a certain dynamics of it which can be studied, analyzed, and should be challenged. So I would argue we're not a violent society or country, but we do have people in our society, in our country, who are willing to use violence for their short-term political ends.
Okay, I'm going to go off topic a little bit because this is obviously the topic du jour, which is what is this election going to be fought on and won? What are the top few issues?
Well, there's more than one. I think the principal issue, obviously, is going to be what happened to Achhe Din. You know, you were promised much better times. How many of you are better off as a result of this government's 5 years? And if they have failed, then why do they deserve a second chance? So the first and most important message is, क्या आपके लिए अच्छे दिन आए हैं? And if not, let's turf these fellows out for their pretenses. So economic development, petrol price rise, taxation, the difficulties you're all facing, the job crisis, a lot of this is going to dominate election campaigning. A second issue must be, however, the growing communalization of the society. Do we really want our children growing up in a country in which people are seeking to divide us in the name of hatred, in the name of communalism, in the name of religion? Or do we want to live as we've lived before that? You know, the live and let live philosophy that has essentially been animating our coexistence for many years. And that has got to be as well a theme. The emphasis on the theme may vary from place to place, constituency to constituency and candidate to candidate. But for myself in Kerala, I'm unambiguously clear that it is one of the platforms I'm going to run on. I want to preserve the plural idea of India, the idea of India as a country where it doesn't matter that you're divided by caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, consonant, costume and custom, because we still have to rally around a consensus. And that consensus is on the simple principle that in a diverse democracy like ours, you can be what you want to be, you can dream the same dreams as everyone else, however, because you agree on the ground rules, not disagreeing. You're free to disagree, but you must agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. What we've got today now is some people in power who are actually challenging those ground rules. They are upending the very notion of what it means to be Indian. And that has to be contested, that has to be challenged. Then there are other issues, inevitably. Corruption, the Rafale scam, the Vyapam scam in Madhya Pradesh, the Chikki scam in Maharashtra. There are different scams of BJP governments in every state. Those will have to be brought before the nation, not least because the BJP's propaganda machine did a very good job of portraying the previous government as irremediably corrupt. And they turned out to be masters of corruption themselves. And it should be pointed out that the very people who pointed one finger at the UPA had four fingers pointing back at them when they finished their term. And fourth and finally, there'll be local issues, because every candidate running is running to represent a particular area and a local constituency, as well as to contribute to creating a national government. So local issues will also feature, and that will vary from place to place.
If you had to sort of forecast into the future, what do you think is going to happen? What are the results going to be?
Well, you know, it's very interesting to see that the RSS has predicted a hung parliament in their publication. And that's a very curious admission that the government that they helped bring to power is in rather deep trouble. I would say that if you look across the Hindi heartland, the BJP is losing an awful lot of votes. It's partly because they did too well last time for their own good. They reached a level in 2014 that would have been impossible to replicate even if they'd had a successful government. Because, you know, UP, 71 seats out of 80, Rajasthan, 25 seats out of 25, Gujarat, 26 seats out of 26, Madhya Pradesh, 27 seats out of 29, and so on and so forth. Chhattisgarh, 10 seats out of 11. They just did too well. They couldn't have matched that anyway. But now that they're not doing well as a government, they've actually let the people down and people see their failure, those numbers are going to be halved. So suddenly it seems to me very clear that the BJP is going to go from about 282 to, at best, in the most optimistic scenario, somewhere around 160 seats. Many others I know put it at lower numbers, 140, even less. At that level, the BJP is out because they won't find allies. They can look around the country, where are they going to find the allies? Even the allies they had in 2014, some have deserted them. Chandrababu Naidu bitter enough to move a no-confidence motion against the BJP. The Kushwaha party, RSLP, has left and now joined the opposite Gathbandhan of ours and Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav's. You've seen a number of allies deserting them. The Shiv Sena is still there, but it carps and cavils and criticizes them on a daily basis. So I'm not sure where they're going to get the allies from to get to the 272 we need to form a government. Whereas the Congress, I believe, is very much on the march. Difficult to give you an exact number because a lot of alliance determinations are yet to be finalized. But I would say that even if the Congress got fewer seats in the BJP, which I'm not prepared to concede, but for argument's sake, in the pessimistic scenario, we got fewer seats, we would still have enough regional parties who would wish to and be ready to ally with us that a UPA 3 is far more likely than an NDA 3.
Well, that's great to know. I think what I'm going to do, I can't see how you can see if anyone has questions to ask you, but I think we'll open it to questions after a couple of...
Perhaps the organizers have people with mics who can go spot because the lights are shining in our eyes. David and I can't see. If you can see, go and give the mics and whoever's got the mic can ask a question.
Well, before we get there, I have two last questions, and they have to do with two signal dates. One is in 2022, we'd have completed 75 years as a kind of middle-aged, kind of getting on to sort of, older nation. And the second is 2025, when a lot of people seem to agree that if we didn't do something radically wrong, we'll be the third largest economy in the world. We will go past Britain and we will come after the US and China.
Actually, we already are the third largest
In terms of
purchasing
PPP,
power
yeah.
parity.
But in real
terms, Japan and Britain are ahead of us.
Right.
Sorry, Japan and Germany are
Yeah.
ahead of us.
So if those are the two objectives that India is shooting towards, I'd like you to comment a little bit on the likelihood of getting there. And if we get there, what are the major things that we need to do to fix persistent problems that don't sort of behoove a country which is the third largest economy in the world?
Oh, there's so much to be done, David. I think it would take too long an answer. I can say that we need to fix, to use today's language, both the hardware of development and the software. The hardware of development being the ports, the roads, the railways, the infrastructure. That, for example, the airports, we've improved dramatically in the last 10, 15 years. The railways, we have not. The ports, very mixed reports. So clearly there's a lot of hard infrastructure work that needs to be done. But there's also the software of development, the sort of human capital. Because development is ultimately about human beings. And human beings need to have decent jobs, decent prospects, 3 square meals a day, a roof over their heads, the opportunity to educate their children, the prospect of a better life for themselves, and an even better life for their kids. Healthcare within reasonable access, let's say a 3 to 5 kilometer walk of your place of residence. There's got to be sanitation. There's got to be decent learning outcomes from our government schools. All of these are waiting to be fixed, and there's got to be skill development, which everyone talks about, but which has been a spectacular failure in this government's record. So what I'd like to see is a government moving ahead simultaneously on all fronts, getting competent people in charge of certain areas and giving them a free hand to get things done. But I believe that that's more likely to come out of a UPA kind of formula where you have lots of very, very competent, experienced people than out of the present system. We've got the paradoxical prime minister as the most recent book. So let me say that in many ways, one of the paradoxes is the two different, not about the prime minister, but about the country, the two different styles of leadership that are on offer to us. You've got, on the one hand, the hero on the white stallion, charging down with upraised sword, saying, I know all the answers, I'll solve all your problems. Just give me power and I'll cut through the Gordian knots of your difficulties. And then you've got another kind of approach to leadership, where the guy says, look, I don't know all the answers. Maybe I don't even know all the questions. And I'll come on foot, not on a white stallion. But I will come to you and I will ask you what you think your problems are, what you want me and my team to attend to. And I will come with a deep bench strength of experienced, qualified, able people who will work with me to solve your problems together. Now that is a totally different approach to leadership, but it's what we in the opposition are offering the nation tomorrow.
Thank you, Shashi. I think we'll take a few questions now because I really don't know how this time thing is working. But we can't see you, so...
there seem to be a couple of young volunteers with handheld mics.
I think if you just give people mics and ask your question, keep it brief, please.
Mr. Devida spoke briefly about Gandhi having projected a non-violent image of India before the world. Having read and written so extensively about Gandhi throughout your career, Mr. Tharoor, what do you make of the racist allegations against him in Ghana and his statue being pulled down in the University of Ghana? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it was a bit sad the statue was pulled down because Gandhi very clearly changed over time. I mean, the views that they were objecting to were the views of a young man, essentially in his late 20s, early 30s, who was also trying to advocate the interests of the Indian settlers in South Africa who were being discriminated against and was therefore anxious to differentiate them from the Africans around. Now, you or I may say that was an awful thing to do, but at that time, that's all he knew. He was a lawyer with a brief. His brief was the interests of the Indian community in South Africa. And so he did say things which he certainly came to regret and recant later. Didn't have an opportunity to explicitly say that, but I think his entire life thereafter has been a repudiation of the kind of mindset embodied in those words. And those words were used for very specific purposes to differentiate between the lot of the Indians and the lot of the blacks vis-a-vis the white authorities in South Africa in order to win some more concessions from the authorities for his people. I think that the context was not seen. Clearly there were disparaging language, there's no getting away from it. And this is why the African students decided that quote-unquote statue of racist Gandhi must be pulled down. But the irony remains that in many ways, the reasons for which his statue was erected, the values he embodied, his ideals, and his deep-seated humanism were lost sight of in that action of knocking down the statue.
Hello, I have a question.
I'm sorry, I have no idea where you're all are. There you are. Okay.
I've just learned about the campaign called Lost Votes by the Times of India. And
Sorry. Oh, yes, the lost vote.
votes.
Yeah.
And I've learned that 1/3 of the voting population of India cannot vote because they don't live where they're registered.
That's right.
I was quite shocked to hear about this.
Right.
I'd like you to talk about it. I haven't heard a lot else. I think everybody should be indignant about this.
Indeed, I mean, people like me are. I've been quite indignant about all of this for some time, but in our system, it's been very difficult to bring about a liberalization of the voter registration process. The process itself is actually not difficult in the sense that you can do it online to sign up and register, and it can be done in 5 minutes. But the problems are that the system is not as user-friendly as it is, for example, in the US or the UK. You can't just go up and sign up anytime it suits you. There are specific periods when the Election Commission opens the electoral register for signing up. There are also verification of whether you really are who you claim to be and live where you claim to live. And if you're not home when they come, they may not register and they might strike you off the list. And there is all the challenges you can associate with the size of our country. People who have already died remaining on the register, people who have moved house remaining at their old address, unable to vote at their new, etc., etc. So there are lost votes. One of the reasons why I believe our turnout is never much higher than the 60s in the percentages is precisely because a lot of the people who don't vote are people who can't vote, either because they're not physically where they're supposed to be or because their names are not on the electoral register. We've even got stories every election of somebody with an election ID card showing up and finding out they can't vote because their name is struck off the list or doesn't appear on the printout at the voting booth. So there are systems that need to be fixed. I'm glad the Times of India is running this campaign. I hope that it will result in people waking up and paying attention, particularly in the Election Commission, which, as you may know, is a completely independent body and which therefore has the right to make arrangements that are different from the ones we've got now. I do believe that generally speaking, a lot more could be done to enable voting. For example, we have a lot of migrant labor in our country. They can't vote because they're physically not where they're registered to vote. And a lot of these people would love to be able to influence decisions at home rather than in their new place where they only see themselves as working temporarily and their allegiance, their interests, their political desires are wrapped up in their hometown or home village very often. But they can't vote there. We ought to create systems in which we have either more postal and electronic voting or a situation in which we set up kiosks for online voting where there are still electoral officers and officials but that people can go show their ID card from Bihar, somewhere in Kerala, and vote for their constituency in Bihar. That ought to be possible. And it's surprising and disappointing that an IT-enabled and technologically friendly nation like India, in the second decade of the 21st century, has been unable to fix this.
Should we do 3 more questions?
I'm happy to take as many questions as the audience has. I just don't know when the organizers will
You
take
need
us
to
out.
sign books as well. We'll take 5 more questions then.
Sir,
Whoever has the mic, because we really
Yeah.
can't pick you.
sir,
The light's shining directly
from
in
the
our
back.
eyes. Yeah.
sir, very good evening. Sir, what's your take on the resignation of Alok Verma as the CBI director?
Well, I think going beyond the specific individual, obviously I'm not competent to judge the accusations and charges against him or for him, so I can't speak about the individual. But the larger concern I have is the one I mentioned earlier in this conversation, which is about the integrity of the institutions of our country. The CBI is one such institution. You may be aware that in many complicated cases, state chief justices, state governments have often referred cases to the CBI to take them away from the hands of local police who might be otherwise influenceable in a complicated case. Today, that kind of reputation for integrity lies in tatters. No one wants to refer cases to a CBI that is so easily manipulated and where all this spy versus spy kind of shenanigans are going on, and number one is suing number two, and number two is making accusations against number one, and the government is sort of doing a midnight swoop and firing one and suspending the other. And all of this stuff has created a terrible amount of damage to an institution whose independence and integrity was of great value in our country and in our criminology.
Hello.
Hello? Yeah.
Yeah,
Good evening, Dr. Saab. I'm here.
Hello.
Center. Right.
Mr. Tharoor, I am Anuj here. Anuj Uppal here.
Just go on speaking. Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Sir, I was very happy you gave a lot of clarification about Mr. Modi as not doing so well in the country. But however, I would suggest that why don't you take the challenge as becoming the opposition instead of Mr. Rahul Gandhi. I think you are very capable. I promise you, sir, the country will have better person to vote than Rahul Gandhi. I confirm you, he is useless.
Listen, let me respond to that. Let me respond to that because the public reaction, obviously for me as a congressman, is worrying and should be addressed. Remember that ours is not a presidential system. Mr. Modi has been trying to run a parliamentary system like a president, but that means we've had the worst of both worlds. We've actually had a parliament that doesn't function as an instrument of accountability of the government, and we have a prime minister who acts as if he's above parliament and above everyone else.
No,
like
sir,
a
but you are from
de facto president.
Congress. I believe so. There are a lot of people who will prefer Mr. Shashi Tharoor as the leader of Congress for
Sir,
the prime ministership candidate.
That's not
And
an option.
Please try.
That's not an option because in our system, it is essentially, because of the parliamentary system, you're voting, as you know, for parties, whether here or anywhere else. It may be a different party here, it may be a different party in Delhi or in Amethi for that matter. But once you've voted, the MPs get together and they will pick the leader of one of the parties to be the prime minister. You are not voting in a presidential election, young man. And the fact is that therefore, the question of an individual name is not what matters. What matters is the values, the policies, the principles of each party, what they stand for, what kind of governance they'll give you. Secondly, honestly, you're being unfair to Rahul Gandhi. I've seen him at close quarters. He is not, as he has been portrayed by the BJP-led caricature, he is not that kind of person. He is actually smart, energetic, curious, reads widely, and is on the ball. And you've seen this on the number of issues he's taken up here. We began this conversation talking about Rafale. Who brought Rafale to the nation's attention? It was Rahul Gandhi, and his relentless hammering away at this is what has created now this major front page story David is talking about, which is truly a major expose. Now, that's only possible because you've had somebody with conviction, passion, determination, and persistence in Rahul Gandhi. Don't write him off so easily. He isn't what the cartoons and the Facebook memes and so on, the WhatsApp forwards talked about. The problem is we can't get our political insights from WhatsApp. We really have to look at the substance and judge. And this is a person of substance.
Okay, we have time for just 3 more questions. You've already asked your question, sir. So I'm going to the next 3 questions.
We haven't apparently asked.
Welcome, Dr. Saab. You are very near to your alma mater, the streets of Park Street. You must be remembering
Yes, next
it.
door, absolutely.
Yeah. You are my contemporary like that. So I am in the twilight of life.
Could you hold the mic a bit closer?
Yeah,
Because-
closer,
Yeah,
okay.
much better.
I have seen people are asking the questions for the recent history, and I am being a man of 69 years. So I have seen Jawaharlal Nehru alive, Indira Gandhi getting killed, Sanjay Gandhi about to become Prime Minister, and Modi and Dr. Saab sitting in the parliament. Ek minute. Now you are talking about Gadbandhan and all these things. We have seen many Gadbandhans from 1967 onwards. Indian politics has become an amoebosis like Gadbandhan. It breaks up, makes anything. You can make many Venn diagrams out of political alliances, Janta group, that group. And you have written a book, A Paradox of India. I need not to read that book. India is full of paradox and similarities. A biggest paradox is that 31 denies 69. 69% people voted against BJP or for their party, but 31 has won. Even difference of 2 parliamentarians makes a government. There is a question arises because I don't have any hope. I have only time to spend in this planet. Do you think that Indian parliamentary system or Indian federalism is a participative? That I have a different opinion maybe there.
Sir, actually, I'm going to refer you to not this book, but an earlier one, India Shastra.
Anyway.
Which has an essay on the merits of the system, of what we call the presidential system, as a better answer to address exactly the issues you have raised.
Fine, sir.
But at the moment, we are sworn to uphold the system we've got. That is what the Constitution gives us, is this parliamentary system. And within the system, I'm afraid you can have a result where a 31% vote can give you a government. I agree with you that it's not ideal, but that is the way we've got it.
But anyway, hello, you shut down.
Sir, we're running out of time. Could you ask
Anyway,
your question,
I
please?
have a question. Senior citizen, 50% more. So, do you think in future, this anomaly or whatever you're calling paradox or anomaly or question or something like that, it has to be abide with since the statute book says so. Do you think the India needs overhauling of its constitution to overcome this anomaly, whether it is by a presidential system of election or ABCDEFGH? But 69 should be honored against
I agree
31.
with you, sir. I agree with you. And personally,
And another thing, how to encourage the more participative federalism than a monolithic federalism like a big party coming to the power. You can say that Gadbandhan is a representation of that kind of thing.
Sir, I want to interrupt you. There are lots of people, and he's got just 2.
Do you think that our constitution requires the overhauling?
yes, sir. I mean, I certainly think that there is time to look at all of this anew. I would say that probably within the political establishment, there is no desire to rethink the system we've got, because that's a system all the politicians know. So it may not happen. But on the question of federalism, even within our existing system, the Constitution permits the setting up of an interstate council. And it's shocking that the interstate council has only met twice in the last 5 years. We could strengthen federalism by inviting state chief ministers on a regular basis, maybe every 2-3 months, maybe twice a year. I don't know. That can be worked out in consultation with them to actually discuss on points and problems from the perspective of the states. Very often this used to be done in our time through the planning commission mechanism as well as the interstate council mechanism. Today, neither mechanism exists. The planning commission has disappeared, has been abolished essentially, and the interstate council never meets. So there are ways in which your concerns about federalism can be addressed even within the existing constitution.
We have time for just 2 more questions. Please keep them brief, because we basically run out of time.
Good evening, sir. Sir, right in the middle.
Okay, good evening. Go ahead.
Sir, any hint that you could give us on the next book that you're working on?
You know,
So some
Yes,
clue.
please give us a hint.
my publisher is
I'm
sitting
an
here.
ardent reader of your literature. So, any fair clue?
That's very, very sweet of you. Let me just say that
Thank you.
my publisher has been asking me the same question. He's very anxiously pushing me. The truth is that right now I'm completely focused on the elections. I both have national responsibilities. I chair the All India Professionals Congress. I've come here from Raipur in Chhattisgarh for my function there. I'm going to Bombay for consultations on the Congress manifesto with people from the film industry. I'm going on thereafter to a function in rural Idukki in Kerala. I'm essentially now completely in a mode in which even the kind of nocturnal writing I used to do to produce the books I have produced is not going to be possible. This is politics is already a full-time job, and I was doing writing in addition to one full-time job. But right now there is no room for anything else. It takes up more than the space one full-time job will. But let me say that there are a number of ideas in my mind, some of which on an idle moment I can churn over at the back of my mind. And I would certainly hope that once the elections are over and the air is cleared, we hope that we will have brought about a big change in this country. Thereafter, in a slightly more stable and calmer environment, that I will satisfy you by coming back with another book. You mentioned literature. I mean, the truth about my writing is I haven't published a novel since 2001. And I keep thinking, should I not go back to that? Because every time I publish a new book, somebody or the other, and very often many somebodies will write to me saying, when is your next novel coming? We're waiting for it. And that's something which I don't want to completely abandon, as I de facto have. 4 of my first 5 books were fiction, and none of my last 13 have been fiction. So that's something I'm also thinking about very seriously.
Thank you.
One last question, and then we have to call it a day.
Good evening, sir. Could you please kindly clarify your views on the policies India should adopt to counteract a world that is turning increasingly isolationist, fueled by artificial news bubbles created by social media?
You're right. I mean, all of these things you said, it is more isolationist, and that there is a sense of division and hatred even that's been whipped up on social media. And this is a global phenomenon, but though in India we seem to have it particularly bad in some areas, because India is one of the few countries where people have actually been killed because of WhatsApp forwards. I mean, that's something rather frightening to realize, that people have been killed because of false rumors spread and whipped up on social media in our country. But the isolationism you talk about is a slightly different phenomenon, in that it's countries, usually countries that used to be the biggest advocates of globalization, who are now feeling a need to retrench and to protect their own, and in one case to build a big wall, in other cases to exit from a like-minded set of community, of countries organized in a European community, etc., etc. So there is a tendency to move away from all the trends that, if any of us had come and made a speech even 5 years ago, or 3 years ago, we would have talked about how globalization is blurring distinction between boundaries between nations. We'd have talked about increasing cosmopolitanism, interconnections. We'd have talked about a global economy that's more knit together. We'd have talked about all of these features that would have suggested a more integrated world. And instead we have what the young questioner has pointed to, which is exactly the opposite. So we are living through a rather confusing and perhaps even convulsive time, where many of the assumptions of the last generation, the great heyday of globalization and of coming together from roughly 1980 to about 2008, economic globalization, communications globalization, technological globalization, satellite technology, computers, internet, World Wide Web, all of these things, which seem to be heading towards bringing us all closer together, is now possibly heading in the opposite direction. There are large China, for example, is going to essentially divide the internet and create its own internet for its own citizens, which is going to essentially shut them off from the rest of the world. All of these things suggest that what we thought was inevitable and irreversible perhaps can be reversed. Now, let's not go too far. No one's going to pull back the jet planes, shut down the global communication system, bring down the satellites and so on. There's still a lot of things that are genuinely irreversible. But some of the impetus and the motivation that human beings had is going to be very different, it seems to me, in the years to come. And we don't have any glib answers for it. We just have to be aware, be conscious, analyze it, look at it, and see how we can take things forward. Thanks. One more question, says the young man. Let's take one more question. Sir.
Sir, you have created a despair. And how to create a better India, proper India. Today's democracy is a demonstration. So how to create better India for new youth to come, and how the experts can contribute in our progress and in our problems. So please state positive things also, because a lot of things have been only despair and criticism. So
Sir,
how to do that?
I want to stress that I'm not by instinct a politician of division. In fact, if anything, I used to campaign in my first election, particularly on the grounds that once the election's over, we should all work together with the opposition parties, etc. I have been somebody who, in this book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, in my introductory chapter, my introductory essay, I talk about how we need to move away from a black and white view. Everyone is either irremediably good or irremediably evil. The world is much more complex than that. There must be shades of grey. I've said, let's, for God's sake, look beyond these binaries and work collectively together. So please don't think that I'm only interested in the political message. What I would really like is a situation where whichever government is in power will also be able to reach out to members of the opposition, and that reaching out will be welcomed by the opposition, that we will together tackle the problems that we need to tackle for a better India. After all, this is a country which represents so much hope for humanity. We are 1/6 of the human race. By 2036, we're going to be the most populous country in the world, and some suggest it may happen sooner because China has just had a census showing a population decrease already in 1 year. So we may overtake them sooner than we thought we would. We are going to be a country, in other words, where the biggest problems of the human race are being solved, and our solutions will inspire hope in other countries, in Africa, and the poor island states of the Pacific, and so on, and bring about perhaps real change. So in those circumstances, it is very important for us as a country to be able to actually stand up for the right thing, to be able to do the right thing by our own people. I mentioned earlier in response to David about the hardware of development, the software of development. To my mind, that's one part of the answer. The other is preserving that indefinable human quality, that quality of respect for each other, of accepting the differences amongst us, of wanting to serve together, of actually saying that we must free the creative energies of our people rather than damp down on them, but we should work together in order to achieve that better India that you've just asked about and that I tried to summarize earlier with David. So I agree with you. Let's not think so much about the so-called new India that some have talked about that seems to be built on the ruins of all that was good and noble about the old India. Let's instead focus on a better India. That is indeed my personal slogan for tomorrow. Let's all work for a better India, a Behtar Bharat. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.
A big round of applause for Mr. Shashi Tharoor over here. Thank you so much, sir, for coming here and honoring us with your presence. And ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tharoor would be available for the book signing after some time after his media interaction is done in the delegate lounge. So please wait if you have to sign the book of yours by Mr. Tharoor. Also, just a warning, please don't click any pictures because Mr. Tharoor is in a hurry. And we have a long queue for people to just get it signed by him. Thank you so much.